Okay. Um, so I wanted to talk about a topic that I briefly touched upon in the last video. Um, and yeah, so this is the nature of introverted sensing um, and traditional attitudes. So this is an MBTI. This links back to MBTI. Um, in I think an interesting way. Um, I guess that the idea of thinking in terms of ethical rules of thumb that have the appearance of universality but have only limited applicability, um, and thinking in terms of tradition and um, trying to preserve uh, historical memory and trying to build policy and society and models of how the world operates and how an individual should act within it, um, according to an SI evaluation of history and human experience. And what I was saying in the last video is this whole idea of thinking in reductive ethical rules of thumb and thinking in terms of proverbs, for instance. You can't have your cake and eat it too. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Links very much back to SITE reasoning, it seems. But that doesn't mean that an SI person necessarily needs to be traditional in their outlook, necessarily. Um, it could very well be that an SI person is untraditional. And the mechanism I would explain for that, or I would put forward for explaining that, because we have the types, we have the stereotyping, and then we have the cognitive function analysis. And there are certain outward behaviors and affects that are associated with the dominance and the inferiority of certain functions, but it's not always, appearances can be deceptive, to use one of these ethical rules of thumb. And um, and the point is that an SI person is operating on an experiential database of information derived through trial and error, through positive and negative experience. And they're drawing on impressions they've developed based on these experiences. And it's all about hippocampal experiential memory and historical memory and learning from human experience and all of these different forces, factors of consideration. And an SI person can end up being very untraditional because through their SI process of consulting experiential memory, they may derive the insight that, oh, traditions are not always inherently valid. And they could derive that through the SI process of consulting experiential memory and history, where traditions ended up failing or proving invalid. That's still an SI process of arriving at a result being untraditional or not traditional. That is, and so it's an SI process of arriving at a personality trait that seems un-SI, but is still technically the result of SI, which I think makes sense. Hopefully, I'm explaining that adequately. Um, yeah. Um, so they can end up appearing very untraditional, right? It's the idea that that's the stereotyping element of MBTI, and wanting to say, it's essentially the dregs of um, the David Kersey kind of oversimplistic, superficial MBTI, where we call different types archetypes, and you're this and that, and it's all based on outward behaviors and appearances. Whereas socionics and cognitive typology tries to get into um, the cognitive roots of behavior and link the external to the internal, the external behavior to an internal process. So, um, so yeah, it's just a common stereotype that SI DOMs can end up being are very traditional people. But the SI process does not preclude, right? So the SI process can certainly produce untraditional attitudes about life and the world. Um, by consulting experiential memory and historical memory and lessons from history and the lessons of the past to arrive at the conclusion, as I said, that tradition is not always inherently valid because there are these past instances where tradition breaks down and proves invalid. And um, and that's an SI process of arriving at a seemingly un-SI result. So anyway, yeah, that's how I would link everything I've said about thinking in terms of proverbs and ethical rules of thumb that have the appearance of universality but are only of limited applicability. That's how that links back to MBTI. And that's how it links back to SI. And whether, incidentally, ironically, thinking that SI will always appear traditional in attitude and view and worldview is itself a very SI conclusion because it because all that relies upon is the typologist's past experience of what SI looks like, right? But there is what something looks like and what something is, right? I mean, a person is the duality of the external behavior and the internal process. And there may even be something in between there. And so um, to assume that certain outward attitudes are inherently linked to only one particular function, there are definitely situations in which um, you could link an outward behavior that is traditionally associated um, with uh, with SI. And yeah, so in any case, I think that's an interesting perspective on how functions will sometimes manifest in divergent ways. Cognitive functions, how they manifest in divergent ways in MBTI. For instance, there is how something looks and what something is. So, we traditionally associate, for instance, the ESFP with, hedonism, activity seeking, opportunism, sensation seeking, right? And um, however, right, you take those outward behaviors, you can't immediately say that this is an ESFP simply because of those outward behaviors. Because what if the person is actually an INTP? And they have, through a TI process, arrived at the conclusion that what is logically most meaningful in life is activity, sensation seeking, and any of the other outward behaviors we associate with the ESFP. So that person, right, might just be cognitively an INTP. It's simply that they've arrived at very ESFP like conclusions in their outward behaviors. And so in that sense, cognitively, they may function like an INTP, but then on the outside, function or look like an ESFP because they have, through a TI process, arrived at what is outwardly very un-TI or seems not TI. So there's ironies there, inherent. I mean, the whole process of typing other people is riddled with all of these weird ironies that come from conflicting impressions based on conflicts between stereotypes and between stereotyping and strict cognitive typology. And, you know, what if a person seems like an ENFP and they're actually on the inside an ISFJ, right? And their thought patterns seem NE divergent in the way that NE is, but they've simply taken an SI interest in divergent writings and divergent novels and divergent creative left field kind of philosophies. And so on the outside, they have all of the NE appearance, affect of creative word association and creative ideas and everything. But really, on the inside, they're operating on a SI basis where they're just collecting experientially all of those previously existing NE insights rather than engaging in direct NE themselves. So the whole process of typing ends up being difficult, a difficult one, because there is the exterior and the interior. And getting at what's really going on the inside, which is its own reality, is a difficult thing. You can't pierce that from the outside because of the limits of perception, right? So you can make deductions about what's going on inside and inferences, but those inferences can be very imperfect. And you could definitely have divergent manifestations, or, you know, someone could be divergent for their type and still be that type on the inside, but the appearance could mislead you from the reality in that sense. So I don't know. Yeah. So that's, I guess, but tying SI back to, I guess, you know, thinking traditionally is not a very good assumption about SI. Of course, I could be misunderstanding the. Well, I don't think I misunderstand. I don't think I'm misdefining the function. It's just interesting how the outward manifestation in behavior may not be linked categorically to a specific internal cognitive process or cognitive function, right? To be more to use the proper terms here for the discussion. In any case, that's all I wanted to talk about for this live stream. So I'm gonna end it right there.